be here. So let's hop into. We are now going to start Unit 3, Part 3. And Part 3 is primarily going to deal with World War One and the greater impact of the war on life in America and on how America sort of relates with the rest of the world. But there's going to be a little bit of background material we're going to have to cover for this. So what we're going to start with right now is Wilson's foreign policy. So if you remember, Theodore Roosevelt used big stick diplomacy, which was basically just, hey, you're going to do what we want or we're going to blow you up. William Howard Taft was a bit more subtle with dollar diplomacy. Hey, you're going to cooperate with what we want, and in order to ensure that you do this, we're going to give you enormous amounts of money. Woodrow Wilson was not above using either of those tactics. But the difference is whereas for Roosevelt and for Taft, foreign policy revolved around what was best for the United States, what was in the best interest of America, what would advance America's prestige, place in the world, and the prosperity and situation of Americans. Woodrow Wilson's foreign policy was, what can I do to get the rest of the world to be like what I want them to be? For Wilson, foreign policy was an extension of his own ideals and beliefs about what government should be, about the nature of rulers and the people that they rule, the power of an executive, and quite frankly, his own weird ideas about eugenics in its own strange way. So the first thing to understand, Wilson was desperately trying to avoid conflict. Now, this is not a bad thing, and I am not faulting him for this. Getting yourself dragged into a war, especially a war that's somebody else's war, generally not a good idea. But what Wilson was trying to do was he wanted to create a situation where essentially the countries of the world would all work together to bring about the realization of his own vision of utopia and perfection. What Wilson was working at is an early prototype of what we would call a one world government. But Wilson's beliefs about, and I think that to try to be fair to Wilson, which is hard for me, which I think you guys know, Wilson's beliefs really aren't grounded in reality. They're more grounded in his own idealistic concept that, like, we're all going to hold hands in a hippie circle and sing Kumbaya, and it'll be great. There is no better illustration of the failure of Wilson's ideas than in Mexico. So Mexico had gone through a series of governmental changes since gaining independence about 100 years earlier. And they had had a series of conflicts and wars with the United States and with other countries, notably France, that really had caused a destabilized environment. During the Taft administration, the Mexican military, with the support of the United States, overthrew the Mexican government and set up a sort of new election cycle to start over again. In the election cycle, the military and its candidates won. Probably not a big surprise. This did not sit well with the opposition and resulted in a civil war erupting, with people being assassinated on both sides and lots more violence. With Wilson coming in, Wilson threw his support behind another political group in Mexico, the The next round of elections, with Wilson's support, saw the socialists come in. And Wilson supported the socialist government of Mexico because he saw it as a way to spread his own ideas into Mexico. And the important things to take out of this: number one, the socialist government of Mexico had no problem with violating people's rights. And they did so in the name of freedom. That it was going to be for the best interest of everybody if, we just violate your rights. Because nothing ensures free speech by locking up people who don't agree with us and say things we don't like. Nothing ensures freedom of religion like banning a religion, confiscating its property, and removing people's rights to practice their faith freely and openly. Nothing says freedom of assembly and petition like arresting anybody who tries to change anything that you're doing or challenge it. Wilson was all in favor of all this. He had no problem with it because it achieved stability. It undermined the Catholic Church, which Wilson had no love for whatsoever. And it also was this kind of socialist idea that he really was looking at in terms of what he wanted in America. Now, in Mexico, this whole series of events did not sit well with many of the Mexican people. Enter a former Mexican general turned bandito, Pancho Villa, looking all majestic on here, General Francisco Villa, nicknamed Pancho. Pancho Villa and his supporters organized a series of raids into the United States. Why the United States? Because Villa believed that the Mexican government was only surviving because the U.S. gave it support, and he wasn't wrong in that. And they began raiding across the border in Arizona, Texas, and New Mexico. This, by the way, is the ruins of Columbus, New Mexico. You can still see there's fire and there's rubble and stuff here, and there's one random soldier guarding a chimney, I guess, in case they come back. Now, Wilson asked the Mexican government to do something about this. And their response was, well, what do you want us to do? He's a bandito. We can't stop him. So Wilson took matters into his own hands. So let me just make sure you understand this. Wilson, who supported the socialists, was basically told to, get lost by the socialists. And then he's wondering why this happens. So Wilson sent the U.S. Army and invaded Mexico. The army was led by this man here. This is General John Pershing. I don't know if it's any relation to the donut or not. Nicknamed Blackjack, by the way. Not because he liked cards, but because he is one of the first officers to integrate black soldiers into his units. Now, in looking at this picture, you may notice something kind of interesting here. Look, who's that guy? It's Pancho Villa, the guy who invaded America. Why is he standing next to Pershing? This is not because Pershing captured him. This picture was taken during the Taft administration when Pershing had trained Pancho Villa and all of his men in warfare. The U.S. had trained the Mexican army, which was now outlawed and attacking us. For 18 months, they run all over Mexico, and the U.S. Army accomplishes nothing. Pancho Villa continues to raid across the border. They don't catch him. Eventually, the Mexican government gets really angry, and the U.S. Navy actually occupies the Mexican city of Veracruz, and there's a threat of an all-out war until they can negotiate a peace. We never do catch Pancho Villa. We never do get back anything that was taken. We never do get reparations from the Mexican government. In fact, the Mexican government, surprise, surprise, the socialists actually confiscate all U.S. property and arrest Americans. Why? Because they're socialists. And Wilson, how dare you do this? Well, because, you idiot, they're socialists. That's what they do. Now, the man sort of overseeing all of this for Wilson was his Secretary of State, Cross of Gold man himself, William Jennings Bryan. And I'm going to give Brian some props here. Brian quickly realized that what Wilson was doing was not really in line with the best interest of America or even Brian's own personal interests. And so he actually resigned after a while. He really probably should not have been Secretary of State anyways, but it was sort of a consolation prize for Brian supporting Wilson in his bid to be president. Now, while the U.S. is busy chasing a bandito across northern Mexico, there are problems aplenty over the pond, so to speak, in Europe. In 1914, Europe, which was a very, very different place than it is now, was basically divided into two giant alliance systems. So here is a map of Europe in 1914. Your two alliances are the United Kingdom of Great Britain, there is no Ireland, France, and Russia. This group is known as the Triple Entente, or Triple Friendship. And notice, Russia is enormous. Finland doesn't exist. The Baltic countries up here do not exist. None of the, Stan countries exist. This is all just Russia. On the flip side, you have the Triple Alliance of the Second Reich of Germany, that's the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Italy. These two alliances existed in roughly a more or less peaceful situation because of an idea that had, for nearly a century, kept Europe peaceful. And by peaceful, I mean, we don't have 100 years of war between England and France. We have a 6-month war between one province of Germany and France, or a province of Germany and Austria, or we have a 2-year war fought in this area here. This area up here is called the Crimea. It belonged to the Turks at the time in the 1850s. But there's really no major conflicts. This is called balance of power. It's the idea that everybody is more or less equal, and because you stand just as much chance of losing as you do winning, you'll stay out of war. And for almost a century, literally for 99 years, this idea works. But that doesn't mean that everything's hunky-dory. There are long-standing issues underneath the surface. And most of these issues involve Germany and somebody else. Germany and France had been in a very minor conflict in 1876. That's the war that actually created the country of Germany. Germany had taken over chunks of France as victory spoils in the war, and now France wants them back. And France wants a chance to get back and get revenge against Germany. The Germans just want to beat up the French again. The Germans and the English. They're engaged in a naval competition to build the biggest navy. Now, Germany cannot win this, so where Germany begins focusing its money is not on building the biggest navy, but on building the largest fleet of submarines. Germany and Russia. Russia is the biggest country in the world with the biggest army in the world. But Germany has the world's best army and the world's strongest army. And they want to show Russia that just because you're bigger doesn't mean that you can beat us. In fact, we're going to kick the shnikes out of you. And then the one that is not Germany, although technically the Austrians are German, Germany or Russia and Austria. And Russia and Austria have a severe disagreement over an area of Europe known as the Balkan Peninsula. So, what we are starting to talk about now is the background of what is World War I. And World War I is an utterly confusing mess. It's not like World War II, where it's a very clear situation of insane man with bad facial hair decides to try to take over the world, or at least most of Europe and Central Asia and North Africa, as well as eliminating whole groups of people because he doesn't like them. And he must be stopped. Okay, it's easy enough to look at that and go, hey, bud, you ain't right in the head. And quite frankly, you're like possessed by the devil. This is not the case in World War I, which is much more complicated and messy. So to understand, there are four long-term major issues that are the backbone of World War I. And they can be remembered by the acronym MAIN, MAIN. And that stands for militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. So what are these briefly? Militarism. The military. The desire to build the strongest, best military and the most modern military by every country. Countries were spending enormous amounts of money in modernizing their military, and there was no point in having this nice, cool, super modern military if you weren't going to use it. And this resulted, even though that technically there's like a balance between the countries, there's definitely some countries are more powerful than others in some ways. Alliances. The alliance system in Europe is very complicated and involves parts of the treaties that are really secret and that nobody, not even the government, knows are there. Well, how can they be there in a treaty then? Because the agreements were made between the militaries of the countries without getting the approval of the governments. Now, there is also an alliance system of a very different sort, and that's a blood alliance system. The issue of family. Queen Victoria of England and her husband, Prince Albert, had 9 kids before Albert died. They would have had more, but he died youngish. Those 9 kids had 42 kids of their own, and then there were 87 more kids. But these children and grandchildren make up the royal houses of pretty much every single family in Europe because of the necessity for royalty to marry royalty, which meant that all of these countries that we're talking about were basically first and second cousins to each other. They hung out with each other at parties and at family gatherings. They spent summers together. They had picnics together. They all knew each other. They all knew each other's strengths and weaknesses. And like any family, they didn't always get along. And there was a lot of rivalry. Imperialism. The great game, and it literally was like a giant game of Risk where everybody sat at a table to build the biggest and wealthiest empire. And the competition between countries to acquire colonies or to acquire possessions. And last but not least, nationalism. The belief that your country is better than somebody else's, to the point where you become hostile and you believe that you are actually superior to other people. This isn't just patriotism where I love my country and I'm proud to be an American. I'm proud to be an American because I'll sing this song again, that kind of thing. No. This is, my country is better than yours, and to prove it, I'm going to beat you up and take over your country because I'm better than you. You're a dummy poo-poo face. Haha, natter boo-boos. This is really kind of what it was. A great example of like nationalism on an understandable or relatable scale are soccer hooligans. That's kind of how that works. And these 4 circumstances mean that there is a long brewing issue in Europe that is not going to go away. And all it's going to take is one dumb thing to set off. And when we get to lesson 2, the dumb thing is what we're going to cover. Peace and love.